Delicate subject. Chapter 33. Jane ventured to the CIC to some changes. The hall line in the way there had the 4 interface pods, all occupied. She stopped a moment and passed David, Joker, Rennie, and Legion, all plugged in? CIC silent. Eerie. She stepped forward into the cockpit and said tentatively, as though speaking to a ghost in a haunted house, "Hi, Edie. I wanted to check in." Edie said, "Hello, Commander. All is well." Right. So, Joker finally got over his uploading concerns? Oh, yes. Legion and David have helped him customize his interface. That's good? He can tell you. Joker's voice came over the intercom. "Commander, you have got to try this. This is amazing. There are so many things about piloting this ship and other ships I was unaware could be used as feedback. This is incredible. Nothing like it. When we head to Eden Prime, I'm doing it from here." Jane smiled. "So it's very strange, but very good?" "It's not even very strange anymore. I've had a lot of practice. Piloting has always been beautiful, but in here, it's elegant. Definitely the word. Edie and David could actually handle everything. Even Legion could. But this has been a vacation in the best-tuned flight simulator I have ever used." Jane wandered back and poked Joker lightly in the arm. "Look, I know you have the opportunity to play with my body, Commander, but no means no." "You haven't actually said no. You've only defined terms." "Can't get anything by you. I haven't actually said no. We can discuss it further when you get your ass in here." Jane laughed and wandered back to Edie, satisfied that feedback from physical bodies made it into the system. She asked, "Hopefully better for your bones?" "That is the best part. No strain on muscles, no physical stress, and I don't need to filter through the pain to get to the information I need." She was gratified and a bit saddened at how much suffering he never complained about. "You are ordered to minimize pain, Jeff. Enjoy your work." "Yes, I do. Okay, I'm about to pilot my way through the Mariana Trench. Dodging giant squid is a challenge, and you do not want to know what happens when one gets sucked into an intake port. Plus, I can do this." The sound of thunder filled the CIC. She said to Edie, "I'm grateful that rain wasn't involved." Edie said, "Thank you, Shepard, for the company. This has been a joy." "You are welcome. What is Rennie doing in there?" "They are interfacing with students at Grissom. David has had many ideas about helping the nonverbal students, and they've designed and are in the process of installing pods of altered functionality and training instructors in their use." David's voice sounded, "Commander Shepard, please make some time to visit. If I may suggest that you link with Rennie, and then she will link with me, and I can help make your visit less disorienting. I am aware you have limited time." Rennie's voice chimed in, "Please, Commander." "Of course. Rennie, I have no idea how long you've been in there, so do what you had planned for today. I can get back to you tomorrow." Getting the hang of a dress, Jane said, "Legion, what are you up to?" Legion's voice sounded. He didn't have the most expressive emotional voice, but he did sound more solid, less tentative. "I have supervised the cleanup of forces on Rannoch. Heretic servers are being shut down systematically. I have hopes that Quarians may land safely on Rannoch within 2 weeks. In the meantime, we have been working on infrastructure planning with the Admiralty Board in order to ensure a smooth transition." Jane's jaw dropped and she said a stunned, "Legion, thank you. To get the Quarians their home world back." "It is our home world as well," Shepard, Commander. So it is. Here's wishing you a successful landfall, to your people, and to the Quarians, and may you both prosper. As she turned to leave, torn between smiles and a few tears, Edie said as a caution, "Be prepared that Jeff could, in fact, make it rain on you inside." Noted. I expect no less. I could also guide you on appropriate retaliation. She wasn't going to interrupt them now. Her vacation was over, but she was fascinated by the idea that her ship was now a potential amusement park. She looked at David's smiling face as she headed to speak to Kasumi. Kasumi did not like to talk much, and although Jane would have enjoyed a chat, it appeared she was deeply engaged in something. Kasumi mostly communicated now through her notes and reports, and all Jane did was wave to get her attention, give a thumbs-up gesture to ask her if everything was okay, and with a distracted nod, Kasumi indicated she was fine and needed nothing. She'd ask if she did. Realistically, there was very little Jane could get for Kasumi that she couldn't get for herself, so she nodded and left. Jack was no longer able to be visited, and she'd be missed. Jack had told Feta stories about how she was raised. David had told stories about how he'd been an experiment. Fetas had ultimately determined she was not unique in this company. Jack had told Jane she was going to head out with Thane and Fetas, having nominated herself as Fetas's bodyguard and buffer. When Jane had presented herself to speak to Fetas, the girl was stoic and silent, and Jack had done the talking for her. Jack had spoken carefully, had not talked about Fetas as though she were not present, also had accepted fully her nonverbal demeanor. Jack had said, "She's not going into cryo." Jane looked at Jack, not willing to be drawn into or create an argument where there didn't need to be one. Jane had turned to Fetas and said, "I trust Thane. I trust Jack. If they tell me that you are worth the risk, I believe them." David's voice had sounded briefly. "She is worth the risk, Commander Shepard. You have taken great risks for Thane, Jack, and I, and for each person on this vessel." That last was for Fetas's benefit. Jane watched Fetas's face very carefully in this exchange, and although Fetas was badass and deadly, she was also out of her depth in present company, and her reticence might be less contempt than fear of error at this point. Jane recalled Thane's assertion of Jane's potential to destroy with a word if she were displeased, and she imagined Jack telling stories about the great Commander Shepard. And David's tone. She'd go with it. Jack could be good cop for a while. She could be lightning and thunder. Jane said to Fetas, "I need to hear it from you, or you could just nod. You still have a few choices. Cryo could be arrest." Jack bristled and Jane ignored her potential wrath, invoking it on purpose. Other assassins have gone into cryo because they were unable to change. You have potential to change. You have a choice, and I promise you, the moment harm comes to my people, and I find it is your doing, nothing will protect you. If you die before I find you, I will find you on the shores. If you betray this opportunity to help your people out of your own inexperience and stubborn, you shall never be whole. Am I clear?" Jack smirked, and Fetas gave her a solemn nod, yes. "Good. Good luck. Rakana deserves better champions than she has had since her people left her shores. When you meet others of your training, be convincing that every Drell life is needed to ensure Drell have a future. That is why you are not going into cryo, and why you will not go until Jack tells me you must. But I imagine she'd kill you first." Jack said with an evil smile, "Damn right I would." Jane said quietly, to Phaetos directly. If the words Masade Pernac exit your mouth in the presence of Thane Krios, you will not be forgiven. I will not allow you to flaunt your ignorance at his expense. He will take any insult at your hands and forgive you for it. I will not. You will show him respect. This time Jack backed her up. Both sets of eyes turned to Phaetos, who did drop her eyes and give what looked like an ashamed nod. You're a damned good actress and a kick-ass biotic, and I'm sorry I won't get to know you better before you leave. Good luck. If I see you again, may it be after your victory, when you are sure of your path and have found your voice. So that mission began with, as long as Phaetos, Yalis, or any of the newly found assassins don't murder Thane in his sleep, all is well until they start baiting slaver traps and hopefully do not underestimate what force is incoming to them. 1,000 reasons to worry. Then she'd remember she'd made and observed at least 1,000 Panifa moves and considered that slavers had thousands of reasons to worry. She had her own 1,000 reasons. With the memory of Garrus telling her to seek him out when she missed Thane, she decided she'd take his advice. When she got to the battery, though, he was in a conference. Damn. She waved hello, and he straightened slightly from the console, gestured for her to come closer. She held up both hands as an obvious sign that she didn't want to interrupt, blew a kiss at him, and turned to head back out, disappointed. She had a foot over the threshold before she was yanked back by the waist with a hand over her mouth to block the involuntary squeak she let out, a tap at the console, closing the door and sealing the lock to red. He resumed his habitual spot at the console, and she heard droning Turian voices for about 30 seconds as he held her tight by the waist, setting her slowly on her feet. In that amount of time she gathered querulous and grating voices of obvious self-importance discussing some obscure hierarchy law about dispensation of resources, according to clan contribution. Seconds dragged by, and there was a pause where Garrus said, I know the law can be interpreted many ways. I also know that if clans are only protected according to their contribution and not according to their needs, it will result in preventable loss of life for those in outer colonies from less prosperous clans. They undertook these ventures without the need to plan for Reaper threat. These ventures have strengthened Palaven, and the yield will help in hardening defense. We need to transcend the law as it is practiced and abide by the values of the hierarchy at its core, which is that the Turian military force must protect all Turians. This includes Turian lives and Turian supply lines. This resulted in another rustle of self-important argument, while Garrus looked at her with combined boredom and antagonized anger. She looked sympathetically at him. He considered her, and then lifted her again, set her on her feet facing him as he leaned sideways on the console, looked her up and down once with a half-hitched smile adorning his mouth, though the smile didn't soften his eyes. He reached for her hands, kissed them each on the back, and then guided her hands to the buttons of her top. Her brow raised as he watched her, the angered disrespect of his attitude toward the conference tempered by his half-smile. She tilted her head in question, and all he did was extend a claw slowly, his expression not changing, making it obvious he'd be happy to slice her clothes off if she weren't inclined to assist. Both her brows rose, but she took sympathy on her Turian, and slowly unbuttoned her blouse, making a mental note to hide some spare clothes down here. She had no idea how long this conference had lasted. It had obviously already gone on too long. This was now the pattern of his days, constant argument with the hidebound. She understood why he came here to work often, likely unwilling to foul his living quarters with these words, this ridiculous wrangle. He could do this here, in the presence of the Thanics, no doubt imagining firing it at certain holdings. These voices were able to insist on the law because they had written and wrangled it in their favor. He watched her with slowly growing approval, warmth in his eyes mixing with the anger. He stood entirely still, speaking only in short, clipped disagreement between obvious repetitions of the same iteration of entitlement, his talon slowly receding as she unbuttoned and removed the top, unhooked and removed her bra, set them both aside carefully, watching his face. When she stopped and stood, he tilted his head towards hers in question, gestured to her pants, and the talon sprang out again with a click of plate. She was not about to discourage this sort of behavior, and if she was a bad influence, he was insistent. This man was clearly suffering. She remembered his Visor's playlist and thought that instead of Die for the Cause, the Hierarchy theme song should be, in his case, Drive to Homicidal Rage for the Cause. With a conspiratorial curve to her lips, she watched him as she unzipped pants, shimmied out of them, then stepped out of underwear, setting them aside less carefully. He blinked slowly at her, turned aside briefly to say to the conference, "As the representative for Clan Umarian, you must be aware that you have received inexplicable tax favors. Your clan has created a credit structure that does not apply to other clans. Perhaps this should be investigated and a differential in representation calculated that way? The differential in funding should leave those mining colonies entirely undefended, as they should be able to afford private defense." That resulted in quite a few angry Turians, including one that was fuming at the idiocy of disingenuous ignorance of obviously maneuvered law. Garrus's claw sprung free again, and he spun his fingers, indicating that she turn around. She should likely find angry Garrus intimidating, but she found mostly that there was too much distance between them, the harsh edge of his voice aiding in a rush of cold prickles down her spine and the rise of goosebumps along her arm and the back of her neck. She turned slowly once around, a dancer's balance on the tips of her toes. He watched, though he responded to the conversation briefly, his head angled down toward the console in undisguised contempt and aggression, his talon to the side beckoned her closer. She stepped forward on the tips of light feet. He yanked her against him, hungry mouth on hers, his extended talon tracing down her spine. Both of his hands cupped her ass and pulled her tighter against him, and his tongue was dedicated to the hard kiss, claiming her mouth until he had to draw back and say, "These are not allegations. They are truths. I submitted a report on these irregularities prior to this meeting. Please refer to the attachments provided beforehand." There was a startled and somewhat stunned, stammering silence while some Turians claimed they had seen the reports. Some Turians denied their existence as relevant to this forum. Garrus's hands started at her shoulders and then smoothed down her arms, warm against chilled and prickled flesh. He took her hands and drew them to the fastenings of his pants, staring down at her as her fingers worked at them. Garrus stated, "These are facts. To route this through the judicial system would take far too long, and I believe this committee has the duty to resolve this issue without further waste of time that should be spent on preparation." He had to listen to more posturing and veiled threats, coldly angry eyes glancing back to her as her hand reached to stroke along his cock. A shudder going through his body, his eyes closing on angry and reopening on mixed anger and lust, the rims of his eyes bleeding into black. He dragged his extended talon over his shoulder ridge and smiled at her in a mix of possession and appreciation of his power over her, cold anger banked, but present. He bent his head as though to kiss her, but he stopped close enough to her for her to feel his breath as mint warmth against her lips until she tilted her head back and raised up on her toes, her hands gliding along his cock, growing numb, tingling, the touch of his mouth to hers, racing reverie into her. He painted her throat with scent, bit at her lip, and his tongue twisted his tongue around hers. He pulled his mouth back from her slowly, watching her, his hands with his thumb on her throat and his other fingers on her shoulders. He pressed her down to her knees with her eyes reflecting blue shades of anger and possessive lust. His eyes closed slowly, and he tipped his head back before he tilted her head forward with his hands on her neck, shifting one hand to her hair and the other spanning her throat. She licked along his length, dedicated herself to the cause, and was grateful to not have to die or be homicidal. To feel the heat and wet slick along her thighs, no doubt he could sit her in warm, rising air. She got lost in tea, mint, numb sensation, listening to querulous voices slowly recede, shocked, Torian counterpoints taken on Garrus's behalf as his reports were reviewed. The argument was loud enough that he was able to release a few heavy breaths, carrying the hints of pleasure groans, his hands guiding her, his palm over her neck, pressing in until he could feel his cock move under the ripple of her throat. A sure Torian female voice took up Garrus's point and discussed relishing a court case, and enumerated her own observations of taxation and representation irregularities, and the argument spun through more iterations of outrage and growing support for Garrus's motion, whatever that was. She fully supported the way he conducted meetings, and to show it, pressed her breasts to his thighs, her hands coming around to cup his ass, dragging from him every harsh breath she could, and savoring the trembling, building to shaking of his limbs. She chased full and dreamlike reverie from him with her tongue, and with each swallow, his shaking hands along her skin. He occasionally spoke, and she heard anger in his voice, but he was breathless, hoarse, and strained. She really couldn't tell if it was influenced by reverie or not, but it seemed the voices of the conference became more reasonable, conciliatory. Some accord met. She didn't have the capacity to understand the words, only the tone. Her body wrapped, head bent under his hands with her mouth hungry on him, her slick thighs pressed together and released with the rhythm of her mouth taking him in and releasing him so she could breathe. Ultimately, breathing became a secondary concern. The press of his hand against her throat, the throb of him, the twist made her savor and draw out that moment of breathlessness. The lightheadedness of reverie was augmented by a tightening like a breath, involuntary gasps, and pressing the rippling skin of her throat into his palm, harder. His hand covered her ear, and she heard the pound of her own heart. The rest was irrelevant noise until it was his breath or his voice, which both became strangled. With a sudden curt dismissal from him, a chimed tone indicated the end of the conference. He made a few taps at the controls, and then his studied, breathless voice turned into a snarl. He lifted her by her shoulders, turned her, and shoved her down on the darkened console, one hand at the back of her neck. His knees pushed her unresisting legs apart as his hand glided up the sides of her thighs, a deep, indrawn breath, and growled approval when he felt how wet she was, a plaited finger gliding into her, withdrawing and twisting into her ass until 2 fingers were sliding in and out of her body, his tongue licking at her thighs, following his fingertips and then spiraling in on her clit. He held her down, growling against her skin as she bucked back against his hand, twisted her neck against his grip, and moaned into the console surface, condensing her breath into wet heat. She tried to grip with her hands at the edge of the console, breasts pressed against the warming glass, but her knuckles blanched, unable to feel her fingers from residual numbness. Her eyes were closed against shattering sensation as he courted response from her, then insisted, then demanded, building her from trembling to shakes to needing to be held down or she'd have fallen. Fingers extended convulsively. She came with rushing moans and collapsing shakes. He withdrew his fingers carefully, looked down the side of her thigh, and bit down, reverie making it a burst of sensation that extended her shaking orgasm. He kept her from sliding off by replacing his hand at her neck, with his jaw open to the sides of her throat, his body pressing the air out of her as his cock entered to full depth, plates against her ass. She could barely catch a breath, her lungs only able to expand occasionally. She was lightheaded, dizzy, as he set a savage pace. He didn't bite down, but the force against her body drove his teeth into her neck, and his tongue followed blood points and trails, his harsh reverberating growl against her skin. He moved his hands under hers, which had been uselessly off the edge of the console. He held the edge, and she held onto the back of his hands, and he used the leverage to slam into her, twisting and seeking inside. She couldn't get enough breath to scream. Hard moans released with each stroke of his body, hard and sharp glass edges under her hips, hard and hot plate and hide, holding her down so she couldn't move. The reaming twist, slide, and turn of his cock blotting out all other possible awareness. The edges of her vision blackened and narrowed as she held on to consciousness, desperate for every moment of his body pressed into hers, listening for the rise and fall of his growl between his breath, along her broken skin and broken breath, and disintegrating hold on being able to feel it all happen. She lost the fight, slipping down into dreamless dark. She woke up later in dim red lighting, disoriented for a long moment in the struggle with uncooperative, fluttering eyes. They were against the back wall of the battery, Garrus still inside, his mouth at the junction of neck and shoulder, his tongue on her skin along with his hum. A blanket was thrown over them. One of them had thought ahead. She said with an exhausted lift of her lips, "Good meeting." He breathed a soft, huffing laugh at her shoulder and said, "I love making you pass out." "You're good at it." He was. He never did it around Thane. Well, not to this extent. Pulling the breath and consciousness from her deliberately seemed to be a private joy he nurtured. "I hope it causes you no actual permanent damage, but I swear to the spirits, if it did, I probably still wouldn't stop doing it." She couldn't tell if he wanted to be forgiven or reassured, or if he just wanted to assert power over her and let her know it. She sighed and settled on the side of light teasing. The damage is likely done. I've fainted quite a few times in my career. You at least make it fun." He laughed again and said, "You've made me an utter deviant, Corinne. I hope you're properly contrite." She smiled weakly. Says the man who once sound-tested for the potential of screams. He abandoned that trial of teasing as his arms came around her tightly, and he said, "Stay with me. Don't leave. Stay with me here, please. Please, Corinne." It didn't matter why. He had his own 1,000 reasons to fear and worry, and she didn't need a list. He spent so much time here alone, and this was the perfect place to build a fire. Perhaps in future conferences he could look back to the spot of embers, and he could half smile with that warmth, though it would not reach his eyes. She relaxed back against his body, surrendered to his arms and his chest, and the press of his mouth at her neck. She ceded control over her time for the near future and said a simple, "Yes." Garrus had his own places of silence, she had learned over time. He was resourceful and self-sacrificing and satisfied with his life of checklists and details, but satisfied and happy were different creatures with different methods and different needs. He took great satisfaction in looking after her, watching over her and others, taking more and more people under his wing, challenging more and more on his home world daily. But happiness was ephemeral, and she had accepted that beyond lust, beyond want, there was need. He needed to have her in his arms, with him still and deep inside her body. It was separate from reverie. Reverie countered and softened only a few of the requirements of this happiness. He needed her love and presence and attention. He wanted to remember each moment of warmth, of connection, of wanting her to need him in return. So many times he'd refused to let her go when she'd attempted to pull away or even shift in his arms. Other times he restrained himself, letting her go reluctantly. Over time it had become less of an odd quirk of mood and more the core of who he was as a lover, as a mate. Where she could be distracted and pulled in several directions, Garrus had focus she lacked. She was torn again in the half-educated twilight of knowing the man, but not his culture. His brief discussion of bonding and its impossibility hadn't been revisited, and she would not ask him to elaborate. She was aware he could study human sexuality, poetry, and literature to his curious heart's content, and she had exactly no resources to help her learn this man. And guessing terrified her. Did he want her focus in return? Did he want merely to focus on her? Would either be enough? Did he long for subharmonics from her? Did he imagine them in his head? Did he wonder what her skin meant, and did he spend time figuring out all of her moods from her scent? Was tasting her moment to moment a pleasure in itself, or an anticipation of desired change? As though he wondered in each moment if the next taste of her would grant him the knowledge he needed. This was Garrus coming to grips with his own needs. Needs he would likely prefer were different, that he could be as withdrawn and detached and unfocused as she. She wished she could be more like him, and she wondered if he wished the same in return, to be able to finally meet on even ground, as unlikely as it was that they'd ever be the same height. At these times she did not speak or explain or entertain him or ask to be entertained. He preferred silence. Questions would go unanswered. Teasing would go unbantered. She slept in his arms often, and she knew he didn't sleep half as much as she did, but he was ever present, protective, attentive, as she often drifted off to sleep or other thoughts, unable to keep up the same focus he kept. He wanted her, yes, and sex was the best way to calm the savage Taurian, but over time he needed more. She was grateful that he felt free enough with her to push her to her knees, to demand her presence. She did know he was slowly advancing, claiming territory as his own, establishing rituals and private space separate from Thane. She imagined he felt as she did, the differential between desired absolute equality and the reality of different needs, different goals, and compromises on what was possible. Right now he used his voice to ask for what he wanted rather than his habit of nonverbal restraint. That was rare enough to wonder what swirled through his head, but she wouldn't ask. She had enough information. He would never get enough. His thirst for the refuge of her body, his need to feel her weight supported by him and her skin guarded by his hands, would never be met. She knew this. The knowledge soaked into her skin from the reluctant drift of his hands away from her, the pained vulnerability that lingered in his eyes when he had to accede to the reality of distance between them. It was Garrus's meditation, if anything else, communion of the press and presence of flesh, perhaps with the underlying ambition to create a spirit that strengthened from vapor to solid reality the more he touched her. She wondered if he felt the urge to bond, and this is how he reached for her as fully as he could, his body in service to his mate, his mind concentrating on safety and the shared swirl of reverie, assured that she was as contented and safe as he could make her. She turned her forehead to press at his crest and slid her fingers over his, light, where he was tight and tangled. Garrus's darker moments were deep, unreachable by words, Not secrets, but all known and catalogued facts he set out in orderly arrangements for her to see. He feared for his people. He feared for his mother's life and waited for that call. He feared for Thane. He would never be able to hold her long enough to make up for opportunity lost, life lost, years lost, kidnap and indoctrination on his watch. He would never be able to protect her every moment, but he could have these moments, held too tightly, breath shallow and spare. Perhaps he also felt deeper communion with her sleeping or unconscious self, able to pour words into her he did not speak while she was awake. With these private moments of the two of them together, his arms pressing the breath from her, his heart infusing her with his intent. She had woken enough times to impassioned murmuring, and they had echoed through her sated dreams, even though she believed he spoke some internal Turian dialect that could not be translated, or he made up new words from his heart, words created under Cerberus monitoring, encoded dreams to be unraveled only when the breath was pressed from her and consciousness lost. Too tightly was just tight enough for him, and as she relaxed her body consciously, his arms tightened into plate press and close breath, a fine tremble in his limbs along with a trace of his tongue over her skin. She would not be the first one to move, the first to pull away, and she vowed to be more careful of his moments and needs, a new meditation in his name for his cause. She closed her eyes and committed to the moment, paying attention to him, just aware of him, his arms, his breath, the pass of his mouth on her skin, his soft wordless murmurs of part voice and subharmonic that were admiration and adoration. She wished she knew a beautiful song to sing, or that her species had a hum that was comforting and not a counterfeit copy. She wished she could tell him somehow in ways that were not words, the way he did for her, and imagined she was deaf, blind, and dumb in the world of her Turian. It would take a lifetime to learn his language. She hoped with her heart, breathed him in as much as his restraining grip would allow, and decided too tight was redefined as necessary. She kept her forehead to his crest, a sure contact with meaning to him, one she would not break. She stroked her fingers along his, a physical movement she was aware of creating moment to moment, letting him know he was her full focus. She was silent, but her breath could carry soft sounds in what she could hope would be appropriate response to his humming sub-vocals, letting him know she was not only listening, but had something to say about him, about now, and that nothing else mattered. Over time, the thin trembles from his limbs stopped, and he relaxed enough that she was able to draw a deeper breath. She decided too tight was not just okay with her, but she might need it herself, and her fingers tightened in his. She gave over her time and her future to the experience of breathing together with joined bodies. She let go of the sense of darkness and desperation, hoped that he could sense it in her muscles and skin and body, that she was, for once, receptive and attentive to him, spared a moment of regret that she was not a Turian and couldn't sense what he needed on his skin, but hoped she could be what he needed through sheer will and determination. Time passed in her built and borrowed bliss, and any number of notifications of Omnitools were ignored, his and hers, until he stirred with a deep breath and a long exhale and said, "I need you, Karim. Stay with me. Don't leave me." She was glad to hear that his voice seemed to expect she would say yes. She brought her hand to the side of his throat and said, "Yes." Not of course, because this was not a matter of course, and she wasn't always available, and to behave as though she would could tear the fragile mood. Focus on what was real, what was important, what was needed right now. Think of just the next breath, not all breaths. She resolved again to not be the first to pull away, to not set a tone or a pace or a direction. She waited for his actions and asked no questions. If a little power over her made him a little crazy, he had that right. She asked him regularly for crazy things. At first, Garrus didn't move at all, and she relaxed back into the embrace he'd held around her body for the past hours, or however long they'd been here. She was starting to feel hungry, cramped, having to attend to her body, but it was muted by reverie, and this time was dedicated to Garrus, not her. He stood slowly with his arms still around her, lifting her off his body with a groan that sounded like pain. He put her down on her feet, facing him, gathered up the blanket and put a corner of it in each of her hands outstretched, so she stood with it like a cape behind her. He stepped in closer, looked down at her, and pressed his crest to her forehead for long minutes, his breathing unstable, easing slowly to even. He stepped back, closed her arms around her chest one by one like wings, lifted her in his arms and carried her out of the battery, wrapped in a blanket, ignoring her clothes in a heap. Give a man an inch, and he'll take a light year. She almost smiled, then remembered a series of posters, and decided this was definitely not the most scandalous thing that had happened. Anybody not used to the idea that Garrus was going to press his advantage as much as possible in any given moment, and that the word advantage was synonymous with Shepard, did not deserve a berth on the Normandy, including her. She decided to keep her eyes on him and his determined look as though he were on a mission, and she had no idea if they encountered anybody at all. He took her to... not his cabin, not her cabin. Thane's cabin, and she tried to work that out. So, the theme here was his control and power, her relative lack of it. Not her cabin, because it was hers, his sense of Turian status denying her that. Not Garrus's cabin, because Turian showers would kill her. Thane meticulously not only kept his own food, but she had clothes here and human food, Turian food, everything Garrus would need to care for her. She wouldn't have walked into Thane's cabin and made herself at home, and Garrus is going to enjoy that as well. He put her down, not coldly, but brusque, pushing her to the bathroom, moving himself to get some food, his grudging acceptance of limited human squishiness and un-Turian stamina. He had to allow her some distance from him, but he didn't have to like it. Garrus had caretaker kink. The thought made her smile as she managed to take a few minutes in the bathroom to work out more physical kinks and ease circulation back into places denied it for a long time, her right foot still entirely numb. She'd have to hide a bit of a limp under a blanket and hope to not turn her foot on anything. Cold water splashing her smiling face and hair brushed back, in better reasonable shape to face whatever he had non-verbally planned. She was grateful for her empathy. She wasn't entirely lost. He was going to use absolute power over her, conditionally and consensually, to make sure she ate, got enough rest, and spent her time in his arms. That's what this man's kink had been shaped into. No space for danger or fear or edgy anything. Other than, of course, blood and sex, because Dorian. His greater desires rolled into getting her a meal, getting her into bed on time, and watching her sleep. Kink often being about the unusual and taboo. In this context, taboo was about establishing routine, normalcy, his very Turian heart insisting he knew best. She'd fuck it up tomorrow, they both knew it, but for now... She moved back to him with a smile, his impatience expressed by him waiting at the door to sweep his blanket bundle into his arms and feed her with her hands wrapped in the blanket, sternly watching her eat, an eternal admonition to get her shit together, as though this expression held for every potential missed meal in the future retribution promised. She was finally understanding, unquestioning, happy and silent, and hoped he could glean from her skin, since he no longer relied on her face or words, knowing her capacity for referred self-denial. Paradoxically, he was the one that had caused her to miss a meal, but that was still no excuse. It really didn't have to make sense. Repressed needs of the heart had their own timing and their own rhyme, and she'd obey his meter. He would make her ignore her mission when she had nothing pressing, and he would make her eat despite herself, even if it was his demand that caused the lapse. And he would, by the spirits, make sure she slept, even if that was not in question due to nothing being pressing. Because now was the only time he could demand these things from her and be absolutely assured of gaining them. His sympathetic magic ritual of warding off harm to her slowly had its effect on him, as she had hoped, and her accepting silence, honor in the depths and not the surface, began to transform him. He did not smile, but his eyes grew warmer, allowing approval and satisfaction, and then the loosening of those into accomplishment, acceptance of potential happiness. He lifted her and put her on her now hale feet, circulation restored. He pulled the blanket from her and dropped it into a heap at her feet, bent his crest to her forehead, and closed his eyes, hard exhales through his nose. He dropped to his knees and wrapped his arms around her hips, his head turned to the side on her abdomen, so tall even on his knees that his crest brushed the underside of her breasts, nestled along the line of her separating ribs. She fought the instinctual urge to pull him back to his feet, remembering Thane's line of, "She who accepts no bent knee, but seeks a strong spine." This was his light year, taken and demanded at the implied given inch. He expected her to pull him up, and her hands nodded to keep from doing it, trying to take in the suddenly reversed license he needed in this moment for her to accept him on his knees, to take that into herself, allow him to take that into himself as a need fulfilled. More sympathetic magic, the exquisitely gentle grasp of his hands on her hips, to lead her to go against her nature, to accommodate his. Her hands relaxed as she understood the spell and the outcome, spread one hand along the fused lines of his crest, bent fingers between the spikes of his fringe, and touched the hide she could reach. She stood and trembled on the edge of rejection, thinking, "You don't ask for much, do you, Vakarian?" But did not allow that to reach her hands, did not use her voice, stood in the sheltering grip of his arms, and felt his breath spread out over her skin. She would not pull away, would not take the lead, would not take his spell from him and wrest it to her own will, with him restored to taller than she was, angry eyes pushing her to the floor as the more acceptable outcome. It would take a lifetime to understand her Turian. He stayed there for so long, her mind in cramped turmoil, her body slowly growing cold, trembles of the struggle in her limbs. He finally stood in what felt like mercy to her, his eyes closed, breath harsh, her struggling to watch, to know when her eyes should close. He kissed her forehead with the use of mouth plates, his voice softening, and knowing she'd run her marathon on his behalf while holding still. There were times that still unnerved her in their taken intimacy, his way of pressing his cock into her as though it was simply a pass of his lips on her forehead, The times she had left his body in the middle of the night for a call or a trip to the bathroom, and in his sleep he'd find her and glide his length back into her, nearly thoughtless. There was no doubt he occasionally preferred to enter into silent and assumed reverie upon seeing her, sensing her body in the dark. She would try to learn. Should she rethink her own sense of human ceremony and sex, and instead seek him on her return to bed, not with simply a kiss on his crest, but by closing all distance between them in his sleep? He stood and lifted her, entered her with no preamble, a revitalizing surge of reverie and soothing of the shambles of her internal landscape. She watched him, though, and that was worth the distance traveled in so short a time. His face was transcendent, all her worries about his happiness being achievable in these short moments reassured fully. He had taken what she had been unable to know he wanted, what was against her nature, and he would do it again, that dammed up need flowing. Against her cold skin he was searing heat, and he took her to the bed, sat with his back up against the wall, his knees bent, with her body cradled entirely by his, her weight supported, their heads tilted together at the crest and forehead. He brought a hand up to cradle the back of her head, guided her hand to slide up along the plaited rounds at the back of his neck to the hide just under his fringe. A Taurian embrace, with the only human component being her.